there's no immediately obvious, as there has been in recent days, story that absolutely demands all of our attention. But PMQs coming up at 12 could be very, very interesting. It's an extraordinary moment, or not a moment, an extraordinary reflection of that old adage about a week being a long time in politics, isn't it? That Kemi Badenoch not long ago was the one whose leadership looked like not surviving, possibly even until the local elections in May, whereas now Keir Starmer's position is, or has been in recent days, considerably shakier. And of course, people, well, some people, mostly weirdos, very keen to claim that Badenoch is embarked upon some sort of renaissance. Their polling numbers for a government that is in the doldrums, the idea that His Majesty's opposition would be polling as low as it is in any other circumstances would be catastrophic. But we are not living in normal circumstances, and we haven't been for a decade, because of what happened a decade ago. And it is to that Rachel Reeves will finally turn later today with a speech that is going to point out the bleeding obvious. I don't know whether we're going to file that under better late than never, or whether we're going to roll our eyes in despair at the fact that it's taken 10 years for a senior member of any government to admit that not being in one of the major economic blocs currently dominating commerce on this planet is an act of supreme idiocy. Look forward to that speech later today. It tallies, seeing as the B word is back in the news, it tallies with a speech from a former head of the armed forces, or an intervention at least, explaining the necessity of a European army, while the Epstein files, to knit three outwardly disparate elements together into one unified theme, the Epstein files make it pretty clear that an awful lot of the movement and possibly even the money behind Brexit came from deeply unpleasant and morally corrupt oligarchs who just like to break things because rules limit the amount of money they can make, up to and including Steve Bannon explaining to the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein why Brexit would be brilliant and why he wanted to fill the European Parliament with fascists, because they could be most relied upon not to put any obstacles in the way of them making untold sums of money. Funny that, isn't it? Funny. But not, I'm afraid, funny ha-ha. And it is to Epstein that we turn first this morning. I told you something yesterday, and I haven't, I'm afraid, made much progress with the thing that I was struggling with. And it is a question of how we properly report, reflect, recognise the plight of Jeffrey Epstein and his friends, victims. Still only one man has been jailed for the industrial scale abuse of young women. And it is those young women whose voices seem to me to be almost quietest. And I want today to turn our attention to the King and the royal family and their failure to properly... They kind of did with Andrew what the Labour government has stood accused of doing with Mandelson. And they haven't they? Would you say that was fair? And the King is on the hook effectively for doing what Starmer did and for not moving quickly enough, for not acting robustly enough, for not really doing anything meaningful until their feet had been brought so close to the fire by revelations in the files at different times. I don't think the chronology is identical, but I suspect that the sin might be very similar. And, we are still a very deferential nation. Most of us have mostly warm feelings for the King, even if we find the institution of monarchy at various degrees of anachronistic or absurd. But not doing this speaks to the thing I was trying to talk to you about yesterday. I didn't fail to find a way into the conversation, but I'm still not quite sure that we're ready for the phone-in, because the phone-in is, we don't care enough, do we? We don't care enough about these women who appeared on an advert released during the Super Bowl, the biggest television audience, I think, on the planet every year. But it's suddenly up there, and the ad spots in the Super Bowl have become almost a cultural phenomenon of their very own. And this advert was released during... it wasn't in the advertising break. It was released while the Super Bowl was on. So, the attempt to kind of piggyback, if you like, the biggest television audience in the world. And it certainly merits your time.
After years of being kept apart, we're standing together.
Standing together.
Because this girl deserves the truth.
Because she deserves the truth.
Because we all deserve the truth.
And you don't know, do you, quite why their struggle for the truth has been so long and so hard, except quite possibly under the heading of people don't care enough. And if you sense a certain reluctance in my voice, it's not the flipping king's fault that these women's stories have not been properly investigated or heard yet. But I think that he is part of the answer to the question of why. And people don't care enough. People just don't care enough. There's a hideous story today about an Afghan asylum seeker being convicted of raping a 12-year-old girl. And you can tell whether someone's racist or not, very simply, by tracking their reaction to that crime and comparing it to their reaction to the Epstein crimes. Should we, for example, be banning all wealthy, rich American men from visiting the United Kingdom because many of them have turned out to be rapists and paedophiles? Should we think long and hard about letting anybody into our country who is rich and white because many of them have turned out to be... I mean, you see what the phone-in would be if I was a hideous hypocrite. So those of us who feel equal levels of disgust at child sexual abuse... because we come at it from the survivor's point of view or the victim's point of view, are having another one of those days where you recognise the epic double standards of everybody else. And that feeds into the question of why, doesn't it? Donald Trump is not currently in much trouble politically, and he was in the metaphorical bed with Epstein for 10 years. Keir Starmer's not mentioned in the files at all, and he's had the worst week of his political career. Peter Mandelson stayed in touch with Epstein long after his hideousness had been established in a court, and so did Andrew Windsor. And the king did nothing. But nobody ever does. So a weird thing happens when an institution is threatened. And that weird thing is that almost everybody involved acts to protect the institution. It's not quite as morally corrupt as it initially sounds. Because if you and I were both committed to something or part of something, imagine we were part of the same organisation, and the organisation found itself knee-deep in scandal, what we would do is ask ourselves, how do we stop the scandal reaching our waists or our shoulders or even engulfing us all together? And that will rarely... This is why what Wes Streeting did yesterday was quite interesting, but we're not talking about that today. Rarely will anybody respond to scandal by looking for more. That's what the investigators and the journalists do. But rarely will anybody on the hook for a scandal respond to it. I mean, the natural reaction... I mean, it takes me back to when I got expelled from school and the school started telling lies about my home life because they wanted the drugs issue that I got expelled for to somehow be removed from the school. So they claimed that it was behaviours that we'd picked up at home, which was absolute rollicks. I never really understood at the time why Mum and Dad were so upset about that. But an institution moves immediately into self-preservation and self-protection. And that's what the royal family has done. It's not so much what Keir Starmer did, because he didn't have to appoint him. You can, of course, pick your ambassadors. You cannot pick your family, to paraphrase another old adage. And I just looking today at some of the coverage. There's a lot here. I'm sorry, it's not quite as laser focused as my introductions are about once every 10 years. But how much trouble should the king be in for this? How big a scandal is this? This involvement in... What is it even? What are we talking about? Are we talking about a cover-up? Are we talking about self-preservation being prioritised above all else, which everybody does, by the way? And are we looking at something that is of serious significance? I think we are. Sheila Fogarty was on characteristically sparkling form yesterday. Don't go anywhere else for your royal phone-ins, by the way. And she really highlights this as a scandal of epochal significance. Crisis management teams, lawyers, advisors, all of that being brought in, not to protect the women whose voices you just heard, or Virginia Giuffre, or any of Epstein's victims, or any of the trafficked young women and girls that appear in the Epstein files. The palace has dedicated itself until this week to protecting the palace. There it is. Gosh, The palace has dedicated itself until this week. Yesterday's news headlines contained a line about William and his wife expressing concern for the victims. And that was headline news. Hello? Epstein, your uncle's Bezzy was imprisoned in 2008 for committing crimes that were well publicised. Andrew must be one of the most scrutinised people on the planet when it comes to what British authorities and British security services do know about an individual. You and I could probably go to Pizza Express in Woking without anybody knowing anything about it. But you can't if you're a member of the royal family. There's two phonies here. I'm not sure I can do them both at the same time, but I'm going to try. The first is, how bad is this for the King? 0345 6060 973. The fact that their senior member of that organisation continued to hobnob and fraternise with a paedophile long after his depravity became established. And we know the depth of that hobnobbing, the depth of those associations. It appears that he has been economical with the actuality with regard to that infamous photograph of Virginia Giuffre with him. There is much more filth in these files than was previously known. And although nobody can claim that anybody should have been aware of things they couldn't be aware of, how bad is this? It's not a question I ask you very often. And there's a reason why, is that it paints too big a goalmouth. And the reason I'm asking it today is because it is inextricably linked to the second question I'm about to ask you. And I don't want to ask you this question, but I don't see how I can avoid it. We don't care, do we? Society doesn't care about the victims of these kind of crimes. Elements of society pretends that it cares when they can make racist or political points about some perpetrators. But when wealthy white men abuse young women and girls, and yeah, I'm putting myself in this category. I think I care, but I clearly don't care enough, because this is the first time I've conducted a phone-in since this story broke that comes at it entirely from the perspective of the women whose voices you just heard in that short film. So, can you knit that? I think you can see why they're in the same vista for me. You can't. You can see why. I'm not making excuses. I'm not making excuses for the palace. I'm simply observing that they have behaved like almost every institution I can think of would behave. And they've moved to protect themselves. And they can only do that because when push comes to shove, they do not care enough about the victims. And that's why my ears pricked up yesterday. That's why it stuck in my craw yesterday when our news bulletins were led by the news that William and Kate had spoken out in support of the victims or condemned the abusers. I can't even remember what it was, because it just felt so weird to me that would be headline news today or yesterday, when the story has been around for a very long time and Epstein's depravity has been established since at least 2008. In the case of Donald Trump, much longer than that, as we'll discover later in the programme. He was speaking to police chiefs about how disgusting Epstein is long before you even knew Epstein's name. So I'm not suggesting for a minute that the palace deserves the benefit of the doubt simply because it's done exactly what everybody else does. But how are we ready to have that? Okay, here's the question. So it's happened sometimes when I'm struggling with a subject. It only pops up at the very end. Why? Why do we look away? Why don't we care more? It's not confined to crimes committed by predominantly Pakistani grooming gangs, although that's part of the same phenomenon. When those young women come forward begging to be believed, they're not. And the same is true of the victims of extremely wealthy white men from all walks of life. Why? Why, when young people come forward to report, and it must take an awful lot of courage to do that, why do we, as a society, so often look the other way? Refuse to listen, we did phone-ins years ago about the Catholic Church. Would you believe that's how old I am? It's how long I've been doing this. And some of the calls we took at the time have stayed with me forever. And it was when you told your mum what the priest was doing and your mum told you off. This is heavy stuff for 10 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. But that's the point, isn't it? Because that's the beginning of an answer to the question. Why don't we care more? Because I don't want to talk about it, James, and I don't want to think about it. And that's a forgivable, even perhaps a completely natural reaction to the worst kind of behaviour that other human beings commit. I told my mum what happened, and my mum told me off. My mum made me wash my mouth out with soap and water. I told my mum what happened, what the priest was doing to me. This is me remembering a call from back in the day, and my mum got angry with me. So the palace did it. The palace didn't respond in the way that we all like to pretend we always respond. Oh my God, an allegation of paedophilia. Break the glass, sound the alarm, stop all the clocks, call the police. Nobody ever does that. In schools, in churches, in palaces, in government. An allegation of paedophilia, an association with paedophilia. Stop all the clocks, call the... No. Crikey, phone the crisis management people. Keep your head down, hope it goes away. And nowhere in any of those calculations and contemplations does the victim or the survivor even appear. Even appear. So, one of the hardest questions I've ever asked you, and please accept my apologies for taking so long to get there. I want you to talk to me about the king, but the central question here, I think, is why? Why don't we do more? Why don't we care more? Why does society almost always edge away from these stories instead of leaning into them, when we often congratulate ourselves on caring more about these issues than we do about almost any other? That's the question. Why do we almost always fail to do what is so obviously right when it comes to behaviour that is so obviously wrong? The palace, hope it goes away, try to bury it. Downing Street, oh, we don't know, it's not that big a deal. We can send him there, he was only friends with him. And of course then you hop over the Atlantic to America, where they're all up to their necks in it and nobody seems to give a monkey's. Why is that? How can it be that on the rhetorical level this is the single most disgusting thing that human beings can do, and we are all absolutely outraged and disgusted by it, and we live in constant fear of our children falling into the clutches of a paedophile, in the way that extraordinary caller yesterday came so close to experiencing. And yet when push comes to shove, when the opportunity to do something about it presents itself, we almost always shirk our responsibilities and our duties. And I don't know why. 21 minutes after 10 is the time. We're supposed to care more about this. We're constantly told we care more about this. We constantly claim we care more about this than we do about almost any other crime ever committed. And yet when we have the chance to address the culprits and the perpetrators, we almost always look away. And I don't know why. Do you?